All right, we will get started. So welcome back to week 2 of our Promising Practices with myself. My name is Neil Stevenson, Director of Learning Services, and with Satnam Chahal, District Principal in Inclusive Learning. 6-part series. I know many of you were here last week. I see some people who weren't, which is great. And we are covering sort of a bunch of themes that emerge out of cognitive science, learning sciences that we think have great value for impacting student learning. Before we get too far into it, we do want to acknowledge that we are meeting today on the ancestral territories of the Tsawwassen and Musqueam and other Coast Salish people. I am actually broadcasting from home this morning, and my home is on the traditional territory of the Semiahmoo people. And I just acknowledge that, and they're grateful to be able to live and work and play on this beautiful land. So 6-part series. Last week, we talked quite a bit about memory and forgetting as the foundation for much of the series that we're going to cycle back on. This week, we're talking about different types of practice, and we'll get into that quickly, and then you can see the rest of the series. We're going to talk next week about how hard it is to actually see learning, and then we're going to talk about the week after about cognitive load. June 1st, we're going to talk about higher order thinking and ways to develop that. And then finally, the last one about planning for understanding. So those are kind of the overviews of what we're heading towards. What we want to do first of all, for those of you who are here, this will be quick. I just want you to take a minute, 2 minutes tops, and I just want you to try to write down on a piece of paper. Hopefully you got something in front of you. Without looking at any notes, that's the key. That you may have taken from last week. Try to draw or remember the first image that we used when we talked about long-term memory. And I'll give you a little hint. There was this character was in the middle of it. So you got 90 seconds to try to remember what you can. All right, about 15 seconds left. All right, we'll stop there. Basically, here's what it was. I'm going to quickly walk you through it, and then I want you to just pay attention to any gaps that you might have, any pieces that might be missing. So the model starts with the environment, that there are literally millions of pieces of sensory data coming at us at any given time, whether that's external, what we see, what we feel, what we hear, what we touch. It could also be internal, like we're feeling things, right? We're having emotions that we're maybe paying attention to or not paying attention to. So there's a whole bunch of data that's hitting us, and we can only pay attention to very, very small amounts of it at a time. And the things that we pay attention to that we're able to sort of consciously be aware of is what we cognitive scientists often call working memory or short-term memory. Those can be interchangeable a little bit. And it's, many studies, hundreds of years have been looking at the fact that give or take, the average person can hold 3 to 5 things in working memory. There can be a little bit of training to improve that, but really we can't go much beyond that. There are things we can do to drastically reduce the amount of working memory, things that we can put in working memory, things like distractions and switching tasks and cognitive load that we're going to get into in a couple of weeks. The process of learning that we talked about is kind of consolidating stuff that we're talking about, into long-term memory, another model we looked at was sort of repeated use builds connections, and then those sort of get cemented the more we use them in our long-term memory. Things go into long-term memory in connections and networks and associations. They don't go in perfectly as is, but they go in really strongly based on what we know before and the meaning that our mind tries to make of things. And the act of remembering is to bring things back from long-term memory into working memory. So any memories that you have, you can try to bring forward. That is the act of remembering. You're bringing it from your long-term memory back into the working memory. Okay. So what you have just done, well, actually, we're going to skip that. We're going to skip that. What you've just done is something called, one of the first powerful practice that we're going to get to in this series is something called retrieval practice. The retrieval practice has a very wide research base in terms of its impact, positive impact on student learning. And at its simplest form, retrieval practice is just the act of bringing something back to mind, remembering it. Okay. Seems really simple, but as we go through this, we're going to see that I don't think it's as common in our classrooms as necessarily it could be or should be. And again, we talked last week about things like memory, knowledge, practice. They aren't necessarily things that we get a lot of workshops on. They aren't necessarily things we talk about a lot. But from a learning sciences perspective, they're super impactful on student learning. So basically, any activity that brings information to mind from memory is a retrieval-based learning activity. Okay, the most common one would be quizzes, and I know we don't love to talk about quizzes, but there is a wide range of positive evidence of the impact of quizzing on learning. The key being low stakes, no stakes. So we'll talk about that a little bit. And again, one of the themes throughout this whole thing about retrieval practice is retrieval practice. One of those subtle little nuances is retrieval practice is not for evaluation to see what they know and what they don't know and to put a number or a score on it, but it's an act of learning. It's a part of learning. If we want to remember something, we have to retrieve it. If we want kids to remember something, we have to give them opportunities to retrieve it. And quizzes, whether we like it or not, are a powerful way to do that. So anything that we write from memory, sketch from memory, a concept map from memory, me having you just repeat, try to draw that, what we did last week. The key is it has to be from memory. You cannot look at notes. You have to try to eliminate as many cues as possible. So any of that is, we consider in this broad sense, retrieval. Okay, here's some examples. So here's some studies for you. This one here is a grade 6 classroom. They went through a social studies unit. They were going through some content. Some of the content, as they went through this study, through this month or this topic, they were using a textbook, and as they were going through it, things that they did, there was some topics, some content they did regular retrieval on, and some that they only just did the regular classroom, but they didn't do the retrieval on it. And at the end of the chapter, so let's say a month later, the items that they've done retrieval on a exam or on a recall at the end of the chapter, the retrieval practice is higher of the content that they did retrieval on. What's important is as you go along and you go to the end of the year, the gap grows. So the more time that passes, the more impactful the retrieval becomes. And so you can see the gap there where the lessons only really drops quite a bit. Any content that wasn't ever retrieved drops quite a lot. Okay, here's what I want you to take a minute to think about, and then maybe type your quick sentence answer in the chat if you can. Based on everything we learned about last week, why do you think retrieval practice might show this type of an impact on student learning? Okay, so there's your question. Sorry for those who weren't here. If you are in a room with another person, you can talk about that. If you want to type it into the chat. Yeah, so we're getting things about moving the learning, keeping it front and center. Remember the forgetting curve. If we only go over anything once, the forgetting curve tells us that a great deal of content that is only ever gone over once disappears, right? So if there's something we want students to know, understand, be able to do, we have to plan for them to try to recall it multiple times, right? Yeah, and the more you use it, the more it becomes flexible and usable, the more it kind of gets consolidated to different parts of the brain. Perfect. So here's kind of some key things about why it works. So we talked last time about that forgetting curve. Forgetting happens immediately after we encounter information. And of course, it's dependent on emotional connection and motivation and prior knowledge and things. But generally, for us, kind of the big thing we're trying to keep in mind is assume kids are going to forget. Assume. And so when we're planning for this, I'm assuming that everything we talked about a week ago, you're going to forget. So the first thing we did today was to start with a retrieval exercise. And then what we just did the second ago is to try to apply some of that learning from last time. Like these are little mini retrieval exercises. Every time a memory is brought to mind, it's reconstructed and reinforced. That's the consolidation, like cemented. Keep in mind though, it does change though. Memories do change. We're going to get into some of that more next week. This is a key one. When students engage in low stakes, they're not just checking it, they're enhancing it. And so this is what we already talked about. The low stakes is important. That's where retrieval practice becomes really powerful. This is trying to break away from test anxiety, quizzing anxiety, and really trying to provide as many opportunities as we can for students to recall things. And it has to be safe. And it has to be a learning experience for them. We talked last time about how recall makes the learning more durable and flexible and transferable. And we looked at those diagrams of the neurons, and the more it's recalled, the more it's cemented, the more it's connected, the more things it's connected to, the stronger it is. And the more things that are there, the more new things get connected. And then finally, this is going to come up a few times today, something called desirable difficulties is a theme that's emerged in the cognitive science research. And basically, there's a sweet spot of the harder we work for retrieval, the more in a successful retrieval will work. So if you do something and then you would try to retrieve it 5 minutes later, that's not going to be as impactful as doing it a day later or doing it a few days later. Now, of course, if you go too far and you can't retrieve it, then that's a problem. So it's trying to playing with the time that we allow. But this notion of desirable difficulties is going to be an important one that we'll come back to a few times today. Here's another study for you. And the thing to keep in mind here, the theme last week was the difference between short-term and long-term. Why we're trying to really have you think about learning being a change in long-term memory. Here's a study where this is a bunch of university students, and they took a text, they took some information, and they did through 3 different groups did a different thing with that. The first group, the blue group, they studied this text 4 times. That'd be a pretty horrible thing to do, but they had these groups of university students read a text 4 different times. Okay. The second group, the orange group, studied, and then they put it away and they took a test. They did a retrieval activity. The third group read the text once and then did 3 retrieval activities. Okay. Here's what happens. In the very short term, the rereading is the most effective. They scored the highest. Okay. And retrieval scores the lowest. That's the short-term learning. However, if we are thinking about learning as long-term growth, the difference is significant for the retrieval. So they ask the students to recall that information a week later, and you can see the scores. And so on the short term, retrieval practice is actually less impactful than other things like rereading a text or studying notes or looking over what you did. So that's why at the very beginning, when we did the retrieval, I said, don't look at your notes. If you look at your notes, we're going to talk about this next time, looking at your notes convinces you that you know it. Forcing yourself to retrieve it is actually consolidating the learning. But in the short term, retrieval actually performs worse. In the long term, the retrieval practice score is higher. Okay, so notice the changes. On the study, they scored 80 on the first time, but a week later, they had lost half of their learning. But the group that only read a text once and then did a bunch of retrieval of it, they only dropped from 70% retention to 60% retention. So they only dropped 15%. Okay, but if we had judged the learning on what the kids did that day, we would have misjudged the impact. Okay, here's another example. Same kind of thing is represented slightly different. Physical. This was a bunch of younger students. They read a passage on sea otters twice, and then they score higher than two students who read a text on the sun, read it once, and then did a retrieval. You test them within 5 minutes. You get them to talk about it 5 minutes. The first group understands it better. They're rereading. But as soon as you go to 2 days later and a week later, the forced retrieval starts to emerge as the winner. We remember more, we can transfer it more, it becomes more consolidated. Okay, so the main sort of mantra or thing you want to think in the classroom is not asking what did we learn today, or me as a teacher, I'm going to review what we learned today, but the question is always asking, what did you learn yesterday? What did you learn last week? What did you learn last month? Okay, constantly pulling things back. So what I want you to do now is take 2 minutes, summarize all of that into sort of 3 sentences, 2 or 3 sentences to kind of capture that in your understanding. All right, another minute. We're not going over time this time. Some great comments coming in the chat. Jason says, sorry to interrupt you if you're writing. Jason's got a good comment. It makes me think about how many minute-to-minute impressions of success are based on kids' short-term successes. Yeah, so we're going to get into kind of some of that next time. And short-term is okay, but the tricky thing is we can't assume that a short-term success equates with the long-term learning. Just because kids get something in the minute doesn't mean they'll get it tomorrow, doesn't mean they'll remember it a week from now or be able to do it. And Lorraine, yeah, more opportunities for retrieval, the more they have. So part of it is doing maybe doing less content, repeat, but going over it multiple times. Some other few ideas on retrieval. Important to know it's not just for facts, right? This isn't just about memorizing. Last time we talked about rote knowledge and inflexible knowledge. It's not just about that, although it does work for that. It's also about conceptual knowledge. It's about having students explain things. It's about open-ended questions. It's about kind of a whole range of things that we want students to know and be able to do. The more they retrieve it and do it from memory and talk it and explain it, the stronger it gets. So this was another study that was done on both kind of verbatim factual questions and higher order inferencing questions. This was in a medical school situation. And again, the retrieval practice scores highest in both. Okay. So ways to do it kind of even beyond just facts. So practicing something in pairs. You know, you've learned a concept, getting kids to explain things back and forth. Manipulating a piece of apparatus. Closing a book you read and then trying to recall the key points of a dialogue that's important, or key points of a speech. You've just watched a great example. My son is in a grade 5 class, and they do this thing every morning where they watch the CNN in 10. It's this little 10-minute news story for kids, and it goes over a whole bunch of world events. And I've asked him, like, does the teacher wrap anything around that? And he says, no. Like, even something like that, just to take 1 minute after you've watched it and write down tell me something you remember about one of the stories, right? And just sort of, it has to be from memory, and it has to be you explaining it, is the key, right? And the more sort of blank it is, the better. Producing a timeline, working in interrogative questions, having kids ask each other questions on a content. All these things are just ways to sort of practice getting information out. The key is it can't be review. And the other thing that retrieval does, which is really powerful, is it also helps us identify what we don't know. And we're going to get into a little bit more of that next week. There's different ways to scaffold retrieval. So here's 3 different levels. Let's say you're doing the water cycle. The number 1 there would just be the most broad. Take out a piece of paper. You remember last week we learned about the water cycle? Take out a piece of paper, draw the water cycle, and label it, right? So that requires students to kind of pull everything. The second one might be a bit more scaffolded. Here's the picture of the water cycle. Can you label it from memory? The third one, which is the most scaffolded, would be, here's the water cycle, here's the words. And so you might go through, these are kind of in reverse order, but you might go through this over the course of 2 weeks after studying the water cycle in order to sort of slowly pull away those scaffolds. Okay, so here's the keys to doing this well. Number 1, has to be low stakes, make it safe, make it quick, make it routine. We know that kids are, going to have a range of comfort with this. And have a range of anxiety. So the more it's routine and regular and expected and safe and playful and fun and kind of ongoing, short, quick, 2 minutes a day, would be great. Explain it to them. Tell them how this works and why it works and why doing retrieval helps them learn better. So it doesn't feel like something that's being tested. You're not testing them, but you're helping build their knowledge and skills. It has to be from memory. It's not review, led by you. Encourage students to do it outside of class. There's lots of research, and we'll get into a little bit of this next week, where particularly high school, university kids, most high school and university kids choose the worst way to study because they reread their notes. And so teaching them this is helpful. Provide feedback so that they know if there is a right answer as soon as possible. Everyone needs to participate. Design for retrieval when you're planning. Anything you're teaching, think about what are the important knowledge and skills you want them to remember, and you got to go back to that. And then finally, it's a tool for learning, not evaluation. Okay. The very last thing, and then we'll give you a little bit of talk time, is this. 2 kind of similar quotes, but I find them quite compelling and challenging. One of them comes from a Journal of Science magazine, the American Association of Science. And it says, a retrieval event may actually represent a more powerful learning activity than an encoding event. And an encoding event is the moment when we first learn something, okay? Jennifer Gonzalez, a blogger, Cult of Pedagogy, whose stuff is amazing. She says that in a much more simple way: better to retrieve than receive, which I think is a very challenging concept, because I know that we as teachers, we often spend so much time and energy thinking about the experiences that we want kids to have. What this is saying is what they actually do with the knowledge, that retrieving it after could potentially be more important to them learning it than what you plan for the actual experience when they learn it first. Okay, so what you can do is we'll give you 3 minutes. If you're in a room with other people, I want you to just talk about that. What does that mean to you, and what are the implications? If you're on your own, you can just kind of write down, jot some thoughts down for those 2 questions. Anybody, if you ever have anything you want to share in the chat, feel free to ask any comments or questions in the chat. I'll give you another minute. All right, we're going to move on. If you've got any thoughts or questions you want to share in the chat, definitely do that. And we're going to move to a couple other kind of slightly different versions of retrieval practice that Satnam is going to walk us through.
All right, thank you, Neil. So we've learned about the really kind of powerful possibilities that retrieval practice brings. And now we're going to talk a little bit about how we can actually operationalize that in classrooms. So there's two ways that this often comes up in the literature. One is called spaced practice, and the other is called interleaved practice. They're actually pretty straightforward. You can probably guess at them just from the labels, but we'll walk through them together here. I'm going to do my best anyways. Okay, so spaced practice deliberately organizes practice over time into smaller chunks. One way to understand it is what it isn't. It's the opposite of cramming or of massed practice. We're going to work through some examples here, but you can just imagine if you have 3 hours of massed practice and you break it up into 3 blocks of 1 hour each, that's what we're talking about for spaced practice. The second way of thinking about this, or of operationalizing it, is actually through something called interleaved practice. So what we're doing here is we're interleaving, or weaving in, I guess, opportunities for students to revisit what was previously learned. This, of course, is in contrast to what's often called blocked practice, where you're really working through a scope and sequence that's quite discretely defined, right? Now we're doing this unit, now we're doing this unit, now we're doing this unit, without a lot of deliberate revisiting. So what both happen to do is they do a great job of really interrupting that forgetting curve that we've talked about a couple of different times now. So just a reminder, we talked about how basically once you start learning something, not too soon after you start to forget it, right? And that's okay. That's where remembering and retrieval kicks in. So once, you've had an opportunity to retrieve it, all of a sudden, you kind of end up in a place where you're remembering more than you would have otherwise, right? Well, the same goes for repeated opportunities to retrieve, right? The more that happens, the more that the amount that you've forgotten has decreased and the amount that you're remembering and you've moved into your long-term memory is increasing. So spaced practice and interleaved practice are great ways to kind of organize retrieval to allow for that to happen in a systematic, deliberate way. So we'll dig in a little bit closer or a little bit more for both of them. So spaced practice, one of the things to keep in mind about it is that it might not always feel very effective to students as they're doing it at first, just like retrieval in general. Sometimes cramming or having mass practice really does feel more effective. We'll talk more about that in the next section or in the next session, but it's deceiving, right? One of the other items that often comes up is what's the right interval for spacing in between these retrieval events? And that honestly varies significantly depending on your focus, the age of your students, where they are in learning this particular content or this particular skill, and so on and so forth. So here's 2 quick examples. The first is a study. It's actually a secondary school study where they were looking at teaching vocabulary to high school students. They had a mass practice condition, which was 30 minutes of kind of focused vocabulary retrieval. And it was compared to spaced practice, where they did that same sort of retrieval activity, but they just spaced it out over 3 separate days. So this isn't a comparison of, just a lesson as usual. It really is a comparison of 2 different retrieval conditions. The spacing itself had quite a significant effect. Having that opportunity to revisit over time and ended up being a much more strategic and effective use of time. This is actually a finding that's repeated quite a bit, and it's one of the reasons why spaced practice often comes up as a really kind of high leverage way of employing retrieval in our instruction. Another example, this is, if that's where we're talking about kids and retrieval practice, another way to think about this is to really step back and think about how we organize our curriculum. We're not going to go into this in any detail right now, but what I can tell you, in case you're not familiar with it, is Jacob Martins, our learning services math coordinator, did a ton of work last year on actually looking at the math curriculum and seeing what it might look like if we took ideas like interleaving and spacing really seriously. spacing especially. So in one example, for example, he takes what could be a 6-week emphasis on fractions and breaks it up into 3 2-week portions. You'll have an opportunity to dig into that as you would like, since you'll have a copy of these slides. Just wanted to bring it up as an illustration for now.
Can I say two things really quickly on there, Satnam?
Yep.
If you go back for a second. So what Jacob has done is he's actually built out the entire K-7 curriculum with a year plan and how to spiral. And so that's what those links are. So if you're teaching grade 2, you can go there and it'll show you like which topics to do and how to repeat them over the year. And really interesting, I was in a meeting talking with Mary Messer, who I believe is in here, and she was saying she's got some of the teachers at Gray doing this. And one of the things that she mentioned, which is really cool, is she said after they taught a shorter, say, fractions unit, they were able to plan for the next unit in a better way, knowing exactly where the students finished it. And so from a universal kind of planning for all perspective, they were far more prepared to kind of teach fractions a second time based on where the kids were left the first time in the year doing it. Sorry, okay. That's it.
Yeah, no, great. Okay, so let's look a little bit more closely at interleaving. So we just talked about spacing. Let's skip this slide here. We'll just jump right into an example because that's oftentimes the best way to see things. So here's a study that came from grade 7 in Florida. They looked at 9 different grade 7 math classes. And what these classes were doing is they were basically spending a term really digging into graphing and slope and so on and so forth. And what they did was they left what was happening in classrooms just as it was. But what they decided to do, what the researchers did, was they varied the way that the homework was structured in 2 ways. You either participated in homework that was interleaved, where you were revisiting things that you were learning over the course of those 3 months, or you were engaging in homework that was more blocked. What you learned that day is what you had for homework, and so on and so forth. Once those 3 months were up, everybody had a chance to engage in retrieval practice and review 5 days later. So this is good practice. And then what happened is they had a surprise test a day later. And what they found was the students who had been revisiting that material all the way along scored on average 25% higher. That was their mean advantage. And a month later, it was 76% higher. So it really speaks, it's a real illustration, I would say, of that forgetting curve in particular, and how engaging in this way can really interrupt that forgetting. Okay, so to sum it up, there's 2 different ways to really engage with retrieval practice here. Well, 3 really. One is you just go for it. I mean, no need to overthink it. And the second and the third is to start to plan out deliberate opportunities, and spaced practice and interleaved practice are ways to do that. Neil, I'm just looking at the time, 3:55.
Yeah. So why don't we take, yeah, we're pretty good. Why don't you take 2 minutes and think about this question, because we want to try to use these things. So think about where's a place in your classroom, in your practice this week, where you can try some retrieval with students. Okay, so take 2 minutes and kind of think about what you're working on right now. And again, if you're in with another group of people in your room, maybe talk through that. We'll give you a couple minutes to think about that. And then we have 1 slide left.